So for us, at least, what I found the most helpful was a pizza would arrive on our doorstep delivered, or a fruit basket, or a care box, or a blanket for the hospital.
Welcome to the Strokecast. A Generation X stroke survivor explores rehab, recovery, the frontiers of neuroscience, and how to peel a banana with one hand.
Hello, I'm Bill Monroe, and welcome to episode 64 of the Strokecast. We'll get to our special guest today, caregiver Melia Wilkinson, in just a moment. I'm releasing this episode on May 1st, 2019. May is, of course, Stroke Awareness Month. And while recent stories about the deaths of John Singleton and Luke Perry are on our minds, and we've gotten to read the amazing story of stroke survivor and Game of Thrones star Emilia Clarke, there is still an opportunity for many people to learn more. So, for this month, consider sharing the Be Fast warning signs for stroke on your Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter accounts, office bulletin board, side of your car, email signature, or any other communication medium that you use. Or do something radical, like talk to people in person. We want as many people as possible to recognize the signs of a stroke as soon as possible, because time lost is brain lost. When someone gets to the ambulance quickly, it makes a huge difference. We saw that in Ann Daly's story back in episode 14, and we hear that again today from Melia Wilkinson. One reason I have the disabilities that I have today is that I woke up with my stroke symptoms, so I couldn't get treatments like TPA. Time from symptom onset makes a huge difference. Be Fast refers to balance, eyes, face, arms, speech, and time for an ambulance. Sudden loss of balance, vision issues, facial droop, arm droop, or speech challenges are all signs that a stroke is happening now. Call emergency services and get an ambulance immediately when these symptoms pop up. And make sure everyone around you is aware, because stroke can happen to anyone at any time. And that brings us to the core of today's show. On this show, we've talked to a lot of stroke survivors and stroke industry professionals, but not nearly enough caregivers. And I'm thrilled to bring more of these folks like Melia Wilkinson to your ears. A lot of the focus in stroke recovery is about how life is different for the survivor, but it's not just about us. Our spouses, partners, and families have their lives turned upside down too. They find themselves thrust into a role in an instant, and it's a role they never signed up for. Suddenly, their financial and career future is also changed. Years of planning for the future are suddenly out the window. Melia lived through those changes 5 years ago and continues to do so today. She's been sharing her story in a series of guest posts on the Strokecast website to help folks understand what happens in the care model after a stroke. And I'm thrilled to bring her voice to the show as well. You can read all of Melia's posts over at strokecast.com/Melia. Melia Wilkinson has lived around the world but currently calls Seattle home. It is here that she, her husband, and their teenage daughter have navigated life after his massive stroke in 2014. In her spare time, she is the sales manager for Seattle Children's Magazine and enjoys a good superhero movie as often as possible. Now, let's meet Melia. So, Melia, thank you so much for joining us here on Strokecast this week.
Oh, I'm happy to be here.
Our web visitors have been reading your articles now for several weeks. I think it's great to finally get a chance to get acquainted.
Yes, agreed. I love sharing everything. It's been great.
And, and that sharing is so important, because one of the challenges that so many of us deal with in post-stroke life is the sense of isolation that we as survivors feel and that many of our caregivers feel as well.
Absolutely. It really does feel like you're an island sometimes.
So, let's start with, what was life like before your husband's stroke?
Oh, that's a good question. Yeah, so normal. We have a daughter. She was 10 when he had his stroke. We had just relocated from the East Coast. My husband made computer games, and we moved out here for that, and had been here about a little over a year and about 3 months in our new house. And life was exciting and fun and normal, I would say.
And did you have your own career at that point as well?
I did. I was a recruiter and in nonprofit, but it was on hold until we had sort of moved in. I was going to start things back up, but I was not working other than some part-time things when he had his stroke. He was doing full-time down in the city.
So, what happened that day?
Yeah, so it was 4 days before Christmas. I'll wait a second to let that sink in. And my daughter was on the couch, and he said, I've got a little headache. I'm going to go back and lie down. And so he went back to the bedroom, and I was making breakfast and brought back some waffles for him. I can still remember it. And he wasn't in the bed, and I couldn't find him. And he was on the side of the bed, and he had a gash in his forehead. And I sort of looked at him, and, right away he was having a hard time enunciating. His left side of his mouth was drooping. And he tried to sort of get up, but his left side of his body was unresponsive, so he couldn't get himself up. And he was twisted in some things that had been on the ground. So I tried to help him up, and immediately it was very clear he couldn't lift his left arm. He was having a hard time sort of completing thoughts. And so I just grabbed the phone and called 911 because I've seen all the things, the signs right away that are stroke. They were there in minutes at the house, and then they kind of got him off to the hospital.
That's sort of quite the way life changes in an instant when that happens that morning.
Yeah. Yep. In a millisecond. And just one plug. We did move quickly. I didn't stop to think about whether or not we wanted to go to the hospital. And he was able to get TPA very quickly, which because of the severity of his stroke, they really do think was paramount in the recovery that he's had. He was at the hospital and had it administered in 45 minutes. So that was a huge deal.
And then after that, though, it sounds like he had some complications.
Yeah, so he had a massive stroke. He did not have any pre-existing conditions. This is the 1 in a million. He blew a clot and ended up being very severe. Sort of conversations about the next 72 hours are critical, and if he survives those, we'll see what's next. And discussions about separating bank accounts and that sort of thing. And so this is from nothing 2 hours earlier, and then he had to do a craniotomy, and he had a second bleed. So there was a lot of moments that were pretty scary, and he ended up being in the hospital and under care for close to 5 months when all was said and done.
And how's he doing today?
Well, that's the good news. So when this all happened, they told me he would never walk, he would never talk, that his memory core was hit, so that he was not going to know who I was, and I had to just prepare myself. So he's home, and he has some severe disabilities, but he is able to stand up and walk with a cane and get around the house on his own. He has full memory retention. Sometimes I joke and say too much memory. He remembers everything. and he knows everything. He has a little delay in his speech. I don't even know that you would notice it as much unless you knew him. He does have some delay. And he gets tired easily. And, and he lives life in a wheelchair when we're out and about because it's a lot easier. But I can leave him alone for the day. He cares for himself. He is on the computer. He does 3D printing, and he's on the computer working on that and chatting with his friends. And he has guys over a couple times a month to play D&D and those sort of games. And so I would say that he's doing remarkably well from what I was told when it first happened.
Well, that is fantastic. It's amazing how, a lot of times I think the medical professionals, they struggle with that whole challenge of, not providing false hope lest somebody accuse them of doing something wrong if somebody doesn't recover, versus if you tell somebody they can't get better and they make the mistake of believing you, then they won't get better.
Yep. It's so hard, but I had a neurologist that came down, and he was my favorite person for the first few months. I had lots of favorites as time passed, but he came down, and everybody had been just doom and gloom, and really, really severe, really scary. And he came in and he looked at me.
It's very easy when you're talking when your skull is sitting in a freezer someplace else.
Yeah, that's exactly it. And so he looked at me and I just sort of said, what am I supposed to expect? And he said, look, it's 0 to 100. Every brain is different. Every recovery is different. We really don't know. And I'll tell you that somewhere in there between 0 and 100 is where your husband will be. And only time will tell, but you have to have hope because we just don't know. And hope is what will sort of get you through this. And I thought, rather than just telling me there was no hope, to sort of paint that picture was amazingly helpful. It was probably the most helpful sentence in the first, 3 or 4 weeks of recovery, I would say.
That's so important. That's what gives you a reason to go ahead and do the work and to do the therapy. Because if you're not going to get better, why not just nap all the time? And
it keeps you from crumbling in a little ball in the corner, right? Like you're like, okay, let's do this. Let's do this. Let's find out. Let's work as hard as we can, and put that carrot in front of us. Give us some hope. Yeah. No, I'm a big proponent of that. I think it's important to be honest, but I think the other thing I think is important that one of the nurses said to me early on is that the ICU doctors, the first doctors, they don't see anybody past the ICU. People don't come back. And so they don't actually know, they see people come in sort of these dire circumstances, but they don't know where they end up. And so a lot of what they're telling you is based on theory or on data, but not on actual case studies and actual people who have come through because they really haven't seen where they ended up.
I think it's a bigger challenge in some of the interpretations too, where, if we start looking 20, 30 years ago where people were talking about after all your recovery is going to be in 6 months or a year, a lot of those studies were limited to 6 months or a year. So it wasn't that you couldn't recover after that. It's just that they had never studied anything past that.
Yeah, my husband is over 4 years out, and he is still recovering. So he still gets recovery at this point. So anybody who says it's over at 6 months or a year just hasn't lived it.
That is so important that, years down the road, recovery is still happening. This is not a fast overnight thing.
No.
It's a long slog, but it still happens.
Right. Yeah. No, and I remember a nurse saying to me at one point, well, whatever he gets back in the first 3 months is all he's going to get. 3 months. And I thought, what? So I think the education of that would be really a great thing out there.
So, how are you doing now? Because we talk about this from the survivor's perspective all the time, but as a caregiver, your life was just turned upside down in an instant there. And that's so challenging for our partners and our families. And so how are you doing with all of this at this point, several years out?
Oh, that's such a hard question. So I am doing good. People ask, in all my life, people ask me that all the time. It's, and I always say that my life is so much harder than I expected it to be at this point. It's just hard every day. But I remember those first days just being devastated. We had a 10-year-old daughter. Like, what was life going to be like? And we just got back from a trip to New York City and Broadway. And 2 years ago, we went to Universal. And my daughter's in school and high school, and we're struggling with all the teen eye rolling and all of those. We're just a normal family, and I don't ever discount that it's hard and that there are days when it just feels overwhelming. But I am really happy to be overwhelmed and have it be hard because it could have been so much different. And so I know it sounds silly, but with Luke Perry recently passing away at the exact age my husband had his stroke, and he had the exact same stroke my husband had, it was a reminder of what it could be like. So that gives me a little bit of sort of an up, remembering that, yes, this is hard, but the alternative would have been much harder. So, but with that said, I do want to caveat for caregivers who are listening that, everybody always says to us, you got to take care of yourself, don't forget to take care of yourself. And I know we all, or I'm sure most of us, just nod our heads. And, but it is important to stay on top of things and to find little moments for yourself and little pleasures, whether it's, getting a manicure or it's, an hour watching Amazing Race or whatever it is. It's so important to carve out your own time because 4.5 years in, I'll tell you, if I don't, then you can't make it. It just isn't possible.
I remember when I was in the hospital, my awesome girlfriend, she was there for most nights. She was staying there. She was staying there all the time. There were a few times I had to just make her go home to get some rest because, she needed it. And from the selfish perspective, and okay, yeah, I was laying there in the hospital. I'm allowed to be a little selfish. It's also me looking at it as, if you're tired and fried, you can't help me.
Yeah, that's it. And it's not a short race. I mean, this is a long haul, and there's ramifications and there's twists and there's turns and there's setbacks, and you've got to have, you're never going to have your end, you're not going to have your tank fully full, I don't think, but at least you have to get it half full as often as you can, and figure out ways to sort of care for yourself. I actually was not doing a very good job of it. I was just sort of succumbing to just not taking care of myself, and I ended up with diabetes. So I've turned it around and gotten myself back under control. And I think that was a really good wake-up call, because it reminded me that there are actually ramifications of, not taking good care of yourself and not taking time and not being very conscious of who you are and your body and yourself and everything, that it's not just words. It actually does end up, detrimental at some point.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, to continue the analogy of, filling your tank as much as you can, it's what even the car people will tell us. If you always run your car's gas tank down to almost zero, you'll eventually blow out the fuel pump that sits in the tank because it overheats.
Yep. And you can think you're doing a good job. You really do. You think, I got this, and then all of a sudden it just takes something, one little thing, and you realize that you need to spend a little more time on yourself and take people up. When they say, "Hey, how can we help?" Just say, "This is what I need," and really do take people up on their offers and know that people want to help. So do it. Take it.
Absolutely. And sometimes it helps to think of it as, when you let people help, you are doing them a favor because it helps them be less powerless.
Yes, absolutely. 100%. I agree with that completely.
I think the other thing that's really important to mention there too, you were just talking about with Perry, and then I think today we just heard about John Singleton. Yep.
51
passing away.
Yep.
The thing is, these are folks who had money, who had influence, who had the best resources available to them, and stroke still took them at a young age. It can happen to anyone. Yep.
They say that the stroke the same stroke that my husband had and Luke Perry had, and is that it's one of the most severe, and it's the one that affects young people the most, and young being relative, of course, but younger, I should say, and it is one of the most devastating because it is it's a full clot blowing, and so it's not just a small stroke, and so people aren't aware that. I can't tell you how. I mean, probably the number one question people asked me in the weeks right after was, what was the cause? What was, and we didn't know for months. It took a long time for them to sort of figure it out, that it was just a blown clot in his carotid artery, and no cause. He had no blood pressure, no anything.
One of the things I think people react to, especially with those of us who are younger, who've been through this, is that they want to know the cause because we scare the heck out of them. Yeah,
that's exactly right. You nailed it. Yep. And they want to be able to say, "Oh, that's not me."
Exactly.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right.
So, I mean, in those early days, obviously your immediate concerns are, of course, your husband's health. Is he going to survive? How are we going to get him recovered? How are we going to get the right medical care?
Right.
Aside from those concerns over his health, I mean, what were you most worried about in those early days?
Oh, so, I think if I remove, my daughter, I was terrified for my daughter, but I'm going to remove that from the equation. But I think the big piece, and one that we're just not prepared for, we don't have any, is the mechanics of things like telling the office and disability insurance and health insurance and coverage. And they kept saying to me things like, you got to separate your accounts because he's going to be in long-term care for the rest of his life and it'll drain your accounts. And what kind of do you have a short term? And don't tell his work. Don't tell, whatever you do, don't tell his work, they kept saying to me. And I didn't know why. And so it was, I think at the age of, I was 47, and none of these things I'd have even thought about. And turns out he had signed up for a short-term disability. This is a plug. Everybody needs to get short-term disability. It's like $2 a month, and it kept us from going bankrupt. So I'm just going to say that right there. But he had short-term disability, but I didn't know that. And so I had to contact his HR and figure all of that out. And then there were just so many pieces that were, if you said the wrong thing on the phone, if you communicated the wrong thing at the hospital, it could really be bad. And so luckily, I had a friend who knew somebody who had been a HR legal person, and she got on the phone with me and kind of walked me through some stuff. But I thought that was terrifying, just the vast amount of unknown on that whole side of the world, just knowing nothing about insurance and how that was going to work, and if he was going to be covered, and who I could tell, and if he was going to be fired or not. And it was really, really terrifying.
Yeah, absolutely. Suddenly having to confront not only just the general operations of life, but all of these complications to the operations of life.
Yeah. And so meanwhile, you're juggling, the doctors and the hospital and your household and the dogs being fed and all these things. And then you're having to make these really life-altering decisions about they're going to impact years of your life, about insurance and talking to the hospital and those sort of things. And it's a lot to come in all at once.
Yeah, and even at that point, when you start talking about the expenses in the long term, not only your life and his life, but it becomes a question of how does this impact funding your daughter's college education?
Exactly.
And the impact of her life decades down the road.
Exactly. Yeah, and so you feel like there's these turns in the road all the time, and there are no signs. You're just having to sort of make these guesses as you go through, and it turns out in hindsight, I don't think a lot of them were as terrifying as they were made out to be for me. But in the moment of it, it felt like I was standing on an abyss and had no idea how to move forward. But I think probably a lot of that was more about the lack of knowledge than it was the actual missteps that could have been made. And
making decisions takes not only knowledge, but it takes a lot of energy. The more decisions you have to make, it's going to tire you out. It's going to get you exhausted. It's why decisions people generally make later in the day are not as good as ones they make early in the day.
Yeah,
it's
absolutely. And you haven't slept in days and weeks, and your adrenaline is just gone, and you're completely stressed out. And it's really hard. Yeah.
And I think that's probably also one important plug for spouses or partners to make sure they are talking with one another before something happens, so you know what the benefits are, what the various programs are, and you're having conversations about insurance and disability. And even then, the big ones, the hospitals are always talking about the end of life decisions to make those in advance.
They kept asking me. I had no idea. I knew a general idea of who he was and what I thought he would want, but we had never had that discussion for sure. And that was, we have since then, and I have with my parents and with everybody I know. What do you want? Tell me what you want. So you don't want to have to make those choices, and so it's terrifying for sure.
Right.
Yeah. And the thing with the insurance and everything, he even says he doesn't even remember signing up for it. That. It just was one of those, it's just literally $2 a month. And he says, I think, it was one of those forms. I just checked it. Well, what the heck? So,
What was the thing that surprised you most about your new role as a caregiver?
Probably how little guidance there is, I think. You do feel very alone a lot of the time, and how many obstacles there are, and how hard it is to get to the next step and to get answers, and to get, there's no expert. there isn't. And so there's not, I feel like in every other part of my life, I've been able to turn to somebody or find somebody. But in this place, there just aren't any experts. There's people who have some expert knowledge on pieces of it, but there's nobody to say, here's how this should work, or here are some ideas, or here's some direction, or hey, here's something you want to think about. There just isn't. And so, you spend a lot of time making mistakes and backtracking and missing due dates and, getting the wrong prescriptions and not knowing that Medicare is taken in one place and not the other, and all of those sorts of pieces that you have to learn really by trial and error, because there just isn't a roadmap. And I mean, even coming home from the hospital, I thought, surely somebody's going to tell me what I need to do in my house. And they don't. You have to sort of figure it out. I had to figure out where to put grab bars myself and find a rental place. And they handed me sort of a stack of Xerox pages in the hospital and said, here's some, and I think 2/3 of the businesses were out of business that I called. So I was surprised by the lack of help. And I want to say that I think one of the issues is funding. I think that there used to be, my understanding is that there used to be people who'd come to your home, and would walk you through and were much more sort of engaged in getting you to the next stage at each stage. But I believe those positions have been eliminated in many places.
When you talk about getting home and having to figure all that stuff out, I think that's really interesting too. I mean, from just the patient perspective, I remember getting home after a month. And I mean, during that month in the hospital, you had this detailed schedule of when they're going to eat, when the therapists are coming in, and you get home and I'm suddenly sitting on the couch. My girlfriend went off to pick up some prescriptions. I'm just sitting on the couch thinking, okay, what do I do now?
Yeah. Yeah, no. And why is this really it? I mean, what's next? Yeah, no, I remember bringing my husband home and it was the first time we had done the route, getting him to the house and then up the stairs and then into the living room. And it just seemed impossible. And I remember thinking, what? It's almost like when you bring a baby home for the first time and you feel like, no, I need a license to do this. Like somebody should have given me more lessons. And I felt the same way. Like this isn't, where is my manual?
Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
And why, when I bought this house just over a year ago, wasn't I thinking about accessibility?
Well, you know what? Thank the gods, because we bought a split level. And so I know, and we had looked at lots of non-split levels, but we have just a half step up, half set of stairs up, and then all the living's on one floor. So we are very fortunate.
Right.
And knock wood all of the time on that choice.
It's amazing, those different things that, you start to think about now, and you just see the world through this perspective of how do we accomplish this with various disabilities. Yeah,
it's so different. Yeah, we just went on a flight back from a trip, and they lost my husband's wheelchair on the flight back. And it was amazing the way people talk about it. His luggage has been misplaced. No, it's not luggage.
Yeah.
So it's just, it's a very different way of seeing the world. And you realize that you were that person on the other side, that it's not that people are mean and awful. It's just that they're uneducated and they don't understand what it's like to not have your wheelchair, for instance.
What's interesting too is as I've been thrust into this world of living with disabilities and starting to just follow some more of the commentary around the community, a lot of people think about the idea of the term being wheelchair bound is something that, is fairly common in our culture. But once you're part of the community and you start talking with other folks who use these things on a daily basis, they're not wheelchair bound, they're wheelchair freed.
Yes. I never thought of that. I haven't heard. Yes, that's exactly right. Exactly. That, it gives you such a different perspective on the world if you can actually get around in it.
One of the things that happens, especially in the early days, is that friends and family are all coming out to offer to help and try and do that. And sometimes, over time that may slow down a little bit, but generally I found people will still help if you ask them. But if somebody wants to help, what's the best way that they can help you, or that they can help a new caregiver or partner or survivor?
So I have a lot of people ask me that. It's funny. It's I thought a lot about it. What I say to people is, just do what you want to do. I know for me, the amount of decisions that I had to make every day, you have no idea. I mean, it's unbelievable. And you're responsible for so much, and so much is thrust on you, and you're continually having to sort of be in charge. And then when somebody says, what do you need? You don't have the bandwidth. You couldn't even begin to stop and say, oh. And so for us, at least, what I found the most helpful was a pizza would arrive on our doorstep delivered, or a fruit basket, or a care box, or a blanket for the hospital, or a stack of cards from my daughter's classmates that we posted around the wall. And So that's one, on the one hand. I think just do something. And, you can ask what they need because there may be needs. But if they say, I don't know, believe them. And then just do something, because it isn't the actual doing. It is the knowing that you're connected and that you do feel very alone, and that knowing that people are out there thinking about you and reaching out to you, for me at least, was 90% of what I needed. The other thing I would say is do ask. I'm going to the grocery store. Can I pick something up? One of the things that I did is I created a group called Melia's Posse, I think I called it. And it was about a dozen people who were local. I put it up on Facebook. I said, this is what I need. I need a group of people that when an emergency strikes, I can just email out and somebody will pick up what I need, and whatever it may be. And 12 people, some of whom I was close to and some of whom I hardly knew, signed up, and then things would come up. I needed a ride to the airport, a ride to the hospital, or Carrie was addicted to Verner's ginger ale, of all things, when he was recovering. And Bevmo Michigan, Bevmo up on the Highlands was the only place that carried it around here. And so I put the word out, and a friend just dropped off a case on my front porch when I got home. So that was one of the things that really helped. And then we had a food train, meals delivered. Twice a week, meals were delivered to the house. I did nothing with it. Neighbors set it up. They put a cooler on the front porch, and that was hugely helpful. And that was set up without me having much to do with any of that. And I think that was the key, was I couldn't wrap my head around what I needed. And then just one other sort of PS, I think what you were saying is true. In the beginning, it's a lot of help, and then it does taper off. And I think it's important to remember, depending on the severity of the recovery, it can go on for a long time. And people would still send me things 6 months out. And those were even sweeter sometimes, because that's often when you're really feeling down and overwhelmed and alone. And then to have something arrive out of the blue is pretty special.
Excellent. And that does make such a difference. And, again, just taking more burdens off your plate, including the burden of having to know what needs to be taken off your plate.
Yep. Yeah, it's, I can just remember I knew I needed help, but to try to articulate that was nearly impossible.
What do you wish the doctors, nurses, or therapists would do differently in those circumstances? I mean, as you're seeing all this and making all these decisions and dealing with everything else.
Oh, so this could be an entire podcast. So I'll try to be brief. So for doctors, I think we talked about it earlier. Don't take away all the hope. That does not mean lie or deceive, but that means only speak to that which you know. And if you don't know, admit it. Say, I don't know, but here's what I think. Because that's so much more empowering than telling people the worst case and then giving them no hope. It's impossible to move forward. And then I think the other thing is with doctors who are not in the neuro facilities, but in the facilities where there's, like we were in a swing bed, to maybe take a deep breath and I don't mean this to sound like the way it's going to sound, but educate yourself a little bit. Don't make a prognosis or a decision if you're not sure you know what you're talking about. These are tricky things, and it felt often to me that it was more important to be right or to say something than to make sure that they knew what they were talking about in some cases. And there were some big mistakes made. And then to nurses, I only have one thing to say, which is thank you. Mm-hmm. Every nurse we had, every CNA, all the way, from one place to the next, were just amazing. And I don't think I would have survived without any of them. They were absolutely that which kept me up and carried me through. And I would give a kidney to any nurse that needed it. So,
that's awesome.
And then the therapists, just thank you. Carrie would not be where he is today. I think the thing in therapy in general is we need to do some work on OT. I think investing in neuro OT would be phenomenal. And I think investing in some more personalized therapy plans would be a really big step in getting people a lot further along in recovery. But I don't think that's the job of any one therapist. And I think as a whole, the therapists care so deeply and work so hard and are so innovative that I have nothing but thanks for all of them.
What is one thing you know now that you really wish you knew in those early post-stroke days?
I think the thing I kept thinking in the early days, because you know nothing, the stroke world is not one you're familiar with unless you've been in it. And, he was so bad. I mean, he couldn't sit up, he couldn't lift his head, he couldn't see anything. And I really thought this was a vision of what life was going to be. I didn't know how much improvement was possible. And so it was devastating to try to think about how are we going to live our life like this and move forward. And I wish somebody had said, oh no, you're just at the beginning. There's so much ahead of you and so much hope. And also for almost everybody, improvements of some sort, whatever they may be. And that was not conveyed at all to me early on. And I think that would have been, if somebody just said, take a deep breath, it gets better. That would have been monumental.
And that can be so important.
Yeah.
So, Melia, thank you so much for joining us this week. This has been awesome.
Oh, it was my true pleasure.
As I listen to Melia's story, the recurrent theme is all about making decisions. There are a lot of decisions caregivers make in the early days and in the months that follow. They range from the big ones like end-of-life care or where to go for therapy to the small ones like what to have for dinner. And decision fatigue is a challenge. Tech luminary Steve Jobs always wore his black turtleneck. Mark Zuckerberg is known for his t-shirt and hoodie uniform, among a couple of other things. These big household names chose wardrobes that meant not having to make decisions about what to wear every day. You see, each decision we make in a day takes energy, and they wanted to save the energy because they have to make much better and more important decisions later in the day. And so do you. And so do caregivers like Melia. That's one reason it's so important for our caregivers to get adequate rest. Rest and self-care aren't indulgences. They're essential to adequately care for survivors and make the best decisions possible. It's just like they tell you at the start of every airplane flight while we're all busy ignoring the safety demo. You've got to put your own mask on before helping others. And speaking of traveling and minimizing decisions and steps, that brings us to our hack of the week.
We like to travel. So I have a suitcase that is pre-packed that has a small bed rail that folds and goes in a suitcase. I have a tray for meals that my husband can sit up and have his meal in front of him. And I have which we carry is a toilet seat that clamps on to help him get higher up. All three of those things fit into a suitcase and they're ready to go so that when we travel, I don't have to think it through. We always have them. We're ready to go. I have a pre-packed kit of his medicine, and we can be at the door in about 20 minutes. And that has made my life so much more pleasant that it feels more carefree and it feels more normal. Carrie's on a CPAP now. We bought a small travel CPAP that stays in there. Yeah. So just make it life easy. Have two of things. Have things ready to go. Don't try to have to unpack it and repack it every time you come home because it's too hard.
To read more about Melia or read her articles on Strokecast, head on over to strokecast.com/Melia. Share your comments or thoughts on this conversation in the comments over at strokecast.com/Meet Melia. Subscribe to Strokecast for free in your favorite podcast app so you never miss an episode. If you're a survivor, be sure to thank your caregivers. And of course, as always, don't get best, get better. Thanks a lot. I'm Bill Monroe, and I'll talk to you soon.
The Strokecast, Bill Monroe, and Bill's guests provide general information and entertainment, not medical advice. Please do not make any changes to your treatment plan or the execution of your treatment plan without first consulting your personal doctor or medical team. The Strokecast is a proud production of the Currently Speaking Podcast Network.